With that, the chair does recognize the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Guinta, for 5 minutes, for hopefully 5 very good minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I indicated in my opening statement, I do believe that the first step to reform is transparency. I'm not sure why we would be concerned to be transparent, why there would be an objection to be transparent. Mr. Cochrane, we see the Fed continuing to expand its role in systemic regulation and credit allocation. Should we worry about its ability to produce sound monetary policy?
Yes.
I'd love for you to expand a little bit more.
I think the monetary policy and regulation are becoming one, and this is kind of the trend going forward. International organizations are encouraging more of this macro-prudential approach. It's also something that's natural to happen. I view monetary policy is actually much less effective than we all think it is, and yet we all want the Fed to do great things. So there's going to be more and more of a temptation for the Fed. If the interest rate lever isn't working a whole lot, well, let's go just tell the banks to do what we want to do, and they have that authority. And it's not really constrained by rules, by tradition, by reporting in the kind of transparency we have here. So I think that's the big question for you and for the Federal Reserve. I think they're anxious for your guidance on how they should approach these questions.
Well, thank you. That brings me to my next point. Chairman Yellen has recently repeated her strong objection or opposition to audit the Fed. And she has stated that she believes it will add political pressure on the central bank and potentially weaken the independence of the Federal Reserve. Again, I take a very, very different view. I don't agree with her assessment. I respect it. We have a difference of opinion. I think transparency, again, is something that the American people and public want. But I wanted to ask Mr. Kupiec this question. Would a full Fed audit, in your opinion, bring more transparency to not only the monetary process, but also the conflicts that these overlapping roles may be creating?
I think this whole notion of a GAO audit of the Fed is very overblown. That's not really what this is about. GAO has the authority to audit everything about the Federal Reserve except for monetary policy. It's very explicit in the law. I assume when that law was passed, the Fed was the one that got that in the law, probably. Now, the only thing the GAO is going to do, if the Federal Reserve has to explain these two policies, is to look at the numbers and see if the Fed is doing what it says it's doing. Did they do the calculation right? Or are they following the same rule? They're not second-guessing the rule. They're not really auditing. They're just telling the Congress so you guys don't have to get out your calculators and figure out if the rule actually says what the Fed's telling you. The GAO will do it for you. That is really all the GAO audit part of the second rule does, in my view. Why the GAO was prohibited from having anything to do with monetary policy, I wasn't around in 1978, I think, when they did that, so I'm not really sure. But the GAO's role here is really fairly minor. The audit is whatever Congress wants. You can create a study group and not involve the GAO and look into monetary policy anytime you want, according to the law.
Okay, I appreciate that. Dr. Taylor, first of all, I think having the GAO do this would, if we don't want to be political or viewed as political, some would argue if members of Congress were doing this, it would be political. So I think it would make it a reasonable argument to ask the GAO to do it. But Dr. Taylor, I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I would distinguish the role of the GAO in assessing whether the strategy's changed or not. That's part of the legislation. Someone's got to do it. I don't really see the problems with that. The full audit issue, I think you have to ask, what would you get out of that? And maybe this is similar to Mr. Kubiak's answer. What would you get out of that compared to this legislation, which would actually be substantive? Here's what the Fed is supposed to be doing. It's what it said they're doing. If they don't do that, you can ask about it. You know, GAO audit doesn't bring you in that direction necessarily. So this seems to me gets more at the transparency issue than the full audit would.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.